Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Valerie Hardcastle. She is St. Elizabeth Healthcare Executive Director of the Institute for Health Innovation and Vice President for Health Innovation at Northern Kentucky University. She specializes in philosophy of neuroscience/biology, philosophy of cognitive science, philosophy of psychology, and the philosophical implications of psychiatry. She is the author of several books, including Locating Consciousness, The Myth of Pain, and Constructing the Self. So, Dr. Hardcastle, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so today I want to get into different aspects of the mind. Let's start with the self then. So, I know that you deal with several different aspects of what could be associated with the mind, like neuroscience, cognitive science, psychiatry, and so on. So, from a philosophical perspective, what is the self?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And, you're going to find in most cases as we go through this interview, I'm going to say, I don't really have a good answer. I don't really have a good answer to that question. I can tell you the way I approach thinking about it. And that is the self is not a thing, like a coat rack or something like that, that you can carve out in the world and identify that's the self. Rather, I think it is more the outcome of a bunch of processes that we undergo psychologically as we develop and learn how to move in our environment. So, for example, one of the things that's true about humans is we have a really great memory system and relatively sophisticated cognitive processing. And because of those things, we're always trying to predict what's in the environment. That's to our advantage because, we're hairless, we're weak, we can't smell well, we can't move very quickly. So in order for us to survive, we need to be able to predict our environment quite well. So to do that, obviously from our point of view, what we want to do is predict the environment relative to how it's going to impinge on our body. And as we do that, the processes we've developed over time is sort of a narrative storytelling, as it were. I see something coming and I relate it to my physical body. And then this is compounded by the fact that we are very social creatures. So we have a very, we live in groups, we have a sophisticated and complicated personal interactions. And so not only do we have to predict our, as it were, physical environment, we have to predict our social environment, which now means we're going to have to predict what other people with our cognitive abilities are doing. And so we start trying to predict how they're perceiving the world as well. And I think this process just starts bootstrapping over time until when you're a fully functional human in the world, you have this sense that you are this thing moving through the environment, and you have a sense of what this thing is based on the predictions that you've made, which you've kind of done in narrative form, and based on your relationships with other people and how you think they react, you think you react similarly. And so really it's this sophisticated story we've told about ourselves as an outcome of trying to predict our environment.
Right. But since you mentioned story there, is the self really a thing? I'm asking you because there are several people that say it's not, and couldn't it be the case that what we call the self is just this sort of narrative we construct over time about ourselves? But when we look into the brain and we look into the mind, there wouldn't be such a thing as the self, or does that make sense?
I think that's correct. So I should have spoken more carefully. I think I was speaking metaphorically when I was talking about it's the product of, right? It is not a thing, as I said, that we can identify. Rather, it's the outcome of these processes that we develop this sense of self. We develop this sense that there is a thing that has these reactions, makes these predictions, interacts in this way. But it's kind of just our bodies plus our brains. That's it.
Yeah, but would you call it an illusion or some sort of useful belief? Or
Well, I guess I would call it a useful belief, or I would say it's a very simple term for a very complicated process, which is something else that, will be a theme as we go through our conversation. Most of the stuff that we think about, we give it a very simple name. Oh, that's pain. Oh, that's consciousness. Oh, that's the self. But when we get down into it, it's not simple at all. And so I think it's we have a toddler's perspective when it comes to a lot of internal processes. So just the way a toddler might have a very simple view of anything in the world, like we have a toddler perspective on a lot of these neurological and psychological states. So I don't want to say it's a misnomer, and I don't want to say it's an illusion. I just think it's such a gross oversimplification that it's almost not useful.
yeah, okay. I think I understand it. So, I mean, I think you've already mentioned this at least to some extent in your first answer, but how do people build their sense of self?
Yeah, I think it's for humans. I think it's just a developmental process, and for people who've had children, you can watch it in action. Um, so I'll give you some examples from my children's lives, and the children are very honest. So my middle child, I guess she was kind of an angry child, but when she was about 6, she had a diary, and in her diary was just lists of things that she liked, she didn't like, and she hated. So, she'd list all of her friends. I like Andrea. I like Jeanette. I like whomever. And then she would say, I don't like Sierra. I don't like so and so. And then every once in a while, she'd have something she hates, like I hate turtles. And that was that was her sense of self, is just this bundle of likes and dislikes that she's trying to sort out. And then my son Quinn, when he was 3, he had the same thing. And you could see it build. So he loved milk. One of his first words that wasn't mama, wasn't dada, it was milk. Moke is what he called it. And then a little bit later, he got more sophisticated, so he knew about moke and other types of drinks. But then he would start assigning values. I like moke, but I don't like spray. And it would go on from there. And then when he go to the grocery store, he could see the milk. So now he's relating his beliefs to the outside world. And I think that process is just what we're doing as adults, as fully fledged humans. It's just more sophisticated. And maybe we're not as upfront about it all the time, just, spewing out what our likes and dislikes and predictions are that we do as children.
Mhm. And can we learn more about the self and how people construct themselves, and perhaps how important it is for people to have coherent sense of self by studying psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia and others?
Well, I mean, there are some disorders that really seem to impinge on a sense of self where you can believe, for example, your self has disappeared or you're dead or the people around you don't have selves. And there, I think you can learn a little bit, although it's not clear exactly how that tells you what the self is, except clearly people can have disorders of self. For people who have things like schizophrenia, where, let me just think about this. I'm not sure it would tell you much about the self per se, except you can see how selves can break down when the information you're getting from the environment is not being processed appropriately, or you're assigning it to, you're assigning it meanings that other people don't assign meanings to. So, you think some signal you see in the world is the FBI trying to get in your brain. We don't. We just see a leaf falling from a tree. And so you can then see how people can take in stimuli and interpret it differently, and then obviously it impacts their behavior and their sense of what's going on around them. But I'm not sure that's the best way to learn about the self and its development. I actually think taking a developmental perspective and watching how children grow into a fully fledged self is probably a better way to really understand, how to carve nature at her joints, as it were.
Right. So moving on to another topic, what is consciousness then?
Yeah, so you ask very small questions.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and of course my answer is going to be, well, we really don't know, but I can tell you how I think about it. And so there's some people who think of consciousness. I mean, a lot of people, including myself, think consciousness is really cool and it's a fundamental aspect of who I am. It's very important to me. And I'm assuming for most people, it's very important to them too. And it's the thing that we want to continue more than anything else. I can lose an arm, I can lose a leg. I'm not interested in losing my consciousness. Okay, so some people start there with this, it's a very fundamental aspect of me. And then when they think about it, they realize how weird and mysterious it is, right? Because it's subjective. It's projected out in the world. It kind of aligns with reality, but not really. Maybe we turn it on and off when we sleep or in other states of being. So they go down the path of, wow, this is too weird for like regular science to understand it. So then they start looking around the universe for other really weird things. And then they have this bucket of really weird stuff and they put consciousness in it, maybe quantum mechanics, the origins of the universe. And they tell themselves all these have to be related somehow because they're just so weird and we don't understand them. I don't think that's a very helpful approach. I'm not going to say it's wrong because I really don't believe we know what consciousness is, but it's not the approach that I would suggest one taking. Rather, I would take an approach of if we want to understand it, we need to chip around the edges. We're not going to get to the essence of it at the very beginning. And then we should start looking for, because this is the way we learn and understand things in our environment using kind of a scientific method, how consciousness seems to break down, when it seems to be missing, how it, what impinges on it and so forth. And from there, we can derive certain obvious conclusions. If I lose parts of my brain, often I lose aspects of consciousness. If I remove your eyes, a lot of times you lose visual capacity. If I do mess with your auditory system, then you're not able to hear anymore and so forth. And so we can at least align aspects of conscious experience with things that are happening with our neurons. So then that seems a really good place to help us understand conscious experience and how what's going on in the brain aligns with our experience. And once we take that step, we find really interesting things. So for example, as you probably know, if you're going to have an operation on your brain, you're awake when they do that. And they will stimulate aspects of your brain to ensure that the part they want to remove or otherwise mess with is not an otherwise critical piece. They want to make sure they're in the right place. There's no room for error there. And so we have a lot of data that we've collected over the years about in brain stimulation studies from surgery. Now, it turns out that if we stimulate the area of your brain that is movement preparation, so you're not moving yet, but you're getting ready to, you're deciding to reach for the coffee pot or kick the ball or scratch an itch, whatever it is, the premotor cortex. When you stimulate that area, people have a sense of movement, not a sense of intending to move, but a sense of movement. And if you stimulate it a lot, they will even insist they've moved, even though they haven't at all. Now, if you stimulate the part of the brain that actually produces the movement, so it's the motor cortex itself, people don't have a sense of movement, even if their body's actually moving. So what does that tell you? Well, it tells me that maybe consciousness is aligned with, again, kind of with the self, our ability to try to predict and understand our environment. It's the way we project our understanding out there. But, as I said, this is just my guess. This is how I approach thinking about it. But I don't have really good hard data. I've got a whole bunch of collection of anecdotes that I've collected over, like 35 years. And that seems to be a story I can tell myself that makes sense of my collection of anecdotes.
Right. But if we don't know exactly what consciousness is it possible for us at this point to answer questions like, for example, if there's any causal relationship between consciousness and subconscious processes that go around in the brain and between consciousness and behavior? I mean, do we know if consciousness causes anything?
Well, certainly and I say certainly because this is what my dissertation was on 1,000 years ago, we can very clearly see a relationship between unconscious processing and conscious experience or conscious reactions. So yes, that's very clear, and that you need to have particular sorts of unconscious processing or offline processing to get the experiences that you do. What was the second question, second part of that question?
The second part was if there was any causal relationship between consciousness and behavior.
Well, I guess I would want to say probably yes and no. On the one hand, of course, I can have very robust conscious experiences and do nothing. I can be completely paralyzed and yet experience all sorts of things. That's not a very interesting sort of example, though. On the other hand, of course, I use my conscious experiences to help myself move through the world or make predictions or rehearse things to myself. So, for example, I looked at the questions you wanted to ask prior to our conversation, and I mentally rehearsed them in an experiential way about what I might approach, how I might approach answering the questions. And now that is informing my behavior, rightly or wrongly, good or bad. So I think, yes, you can correlate conscious experiences to behavioral responses. Is it an easy one-to-one correlation? No, not. It's like most things, it's messy.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is the relationship between consciousness and cognition?
Well, I guess I would say that consciousness is one of the byproducts of cognition, if you take the way I'm approaching consciousness as the correct one. That is, if you think of cognition as the brain's struggle to try to predict and understand its environment, and does that kind of in a narrative form, you know, it assigns meaning to objects and then meanings to its own person, its own body, and tells stories about how things that are going to interact, then consciousness is also part of that sort of larger brain mechanism for understanding and predicting our environment. And again, you know, like our stories, it's not a one-to-one correlation. It's just kind of our brain's best guesses about the useful information that we need to get around in an environment, and that's how it turns out. Why does it turn out that way? I have no idea. But I think that would be the way that I think about the relationship between cognition, kind of broadly construed, and consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And talking about cognition, do you think that embodied cognition would have anything to say about consciousness?
Well, certainly I do, in the sense that our brains are embodied and our experiences are the experiences of someone in the body. And if we think about, you know, the whole reason for our body and our brain's existence is to get around in our environment so that we can procreate, we can eat, and we can defend ourselves or hide from enemies, then clearly there's going to be a tight connection between our cognition, which is embodied, and the way conscious experience or consciousness seems to us.
Right. I mean, I was just thinking of the work done by people like Antonio Damasio, who try to build a theory of consciousness starting from embodied cognition and then moving up several levels until we get consciousness. I mean, I'm not sure if that's the correct way of thinking about it, and if there's enough evidence to say that it works that way or not. But
I don't think there's enough evidence to say it works anyway at all. So, you know, that's Damasio's best guess about how to think about it. My approach is very, very similar. So, you know, I'm not going to say, well, that's a terrible approach, because mine is a cousin of it. And so I think what you see when you talk to people who worry about consciousness, I mean, they kind of come at it from their area of expertise and what other things that they think about from a scientific point of view, and then they kind of slap consciousness on top of it. I'm guilty of that too. And so I don't, you know, when you step back and look at the whole field, I don't know that we yet have the best the best theoretical or methodological approach for understanding consciousness. We really just have a whole bunch of sciencey anecdotes that we're trying to package together into some system that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's see if this question is somewhat easier, and it also connects, at least to some extent, to consciousness. What is pain?
Yes, so nobody really knows, and no, I think people have a much better idea about what pain is, but it is extremely complicated. And I think that's one of these places where philosophers at the beginning just got it flat wrong. And so when I was a graduate student, as I said, 35 years ago or so, people used pain as the simple example of consciousness as they were trying to figure out what consciousness was. So the original approach, which, makes sense, is you try to take something, some little simple tidbit of it. And we knew right away that like visual perception is very complicated, auditory perception, all that's very complicated, but maybe there's something simple like a pain experience, a sharp pain. And if we could get a handle on that, then we could bootstrap our way into understanding a whole bunch of stuff about the mind and the brain. Unfortunately, I think philosophers accidentally kind of stumbled on what to me is like one of the most complex systems in our entire brain. And it's complicated for two reasons. One is that it's a fundamental response and activity that bodies have to be able to interact with their environment. We have to know when danger is imminent, and we need to have some response for when our body is damaged so that we can protect ourselves, nurse ourselves, repair ourselves, whatever it is. So it's a very basic type of response. Now, I realized that what philosophers were talking about was the conscious aspect of pain, not kind of like the pain process itself. But then the product of this being like a fundamental aspect of learning when your body is in danger in the environment means that there's no pain processing system in our brain like there is a visual processing system or an auditory processing system. It's too primitive for that. It's too old. But now we've got these very complicated brains. So this very old system now interacts with all of these other systems that we have. And as a result, pain just becomes really weird. So we have these pain sensations, but we can impact how pain feels to us by our emotional state, by our psychological state, by what we believe about our environment, how we're engaging with the environment. And that's just this very primitive, essentially a non-system, non-dedicated system interacting with all the other stuff in our brain, because that's how it's, kind of formed evolutionarily speaking. Everything kind of ends up more or less, 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon connected to one another. Okay, so then when we look at pain in humans, and this is from the work of Apkarian, we really see a very clear process. So it's not just about the sharp thing that you feel, but for most pain experiences, you have an anticipation of pain. If you ever fall off your bicycle, you know what I'm talking about, because you're falling. Anytime you trip and fall and there's nothing you can do about it, you have that sense of doom. Oh, this is really going to hurt, right? Mm-hmm. There's that unpleasant sensation of anticipating something bad. Then you get the experience that most people call pain itself. But then when the pain resolves, you get an actual sense of relief. It's not just that it goes away, but you feel better. And so we have this whole complex of experiences that are tied to the pain experience. And I think that's very important, because once we understand that, and then once we now have enough studies to see like what areas of the brain are engaged in pain processing, you can see it's tied into our reward system. And it functions in many ways analogous to the way things like addiction functions or reward and punishment functions. And again, it's all these very primitive systems that have been kind of co-opted and mangled over the years. So to answer your question about what is pain, it's a really, really complicated process in our brain that's a whole mix of things. And we don't have a good handle on it yet, but we're getting there.
Okay, so I guess it was as hard as the previous
Yes.
question. So, I mean, let's move on to other topics. I know you're also interested in the philosophy of psychiatry. So, is it possible to strictly distinguish between normal and abnormal psychological conditions?
Well, I'm going to have to say that kind of depends on what psychiatric or psychological condition one is talking about. I think there are some that are very clearly delineated, and I'll pick on something like dementia. It may have a slow onset, but it's a very clear breakdown of the brain, and we can see it happen. And there are different types of dementia, and that we can see how it breaks down. And so I would say in that case, I mean, maybe it's fuzzy when you're not quite, demented yet, but you're on that trajectory versus when you're severely demented. But I think that's very, very clear. There are other cases where I think, no, it's not at all clear. And I'll pick on addiction as a case, because as I indicated before, addiction really is, people want to talk about it as a malfunction maybe of our reward system. But the truth is, every aspect of addiction that we understand, sort of the seeking of the substance of choice, the obsessive engaging in the substance of choice, the compulsive behavior or impulsive behavior, depending on where you are on the spectrum of addiction, all those are actually very clearly understood reward behavior mechanisms. It's just how our learning system functions. And so when you have our learning system in an environment in which the body has been stressed through trauma or other things, you can, get this type of, I'm just going to call it obsessive behavior. Your window of behavioral possibilities narrows, but it's a completely normal process. It's an outcome of normal brains behaving as they should in their environment. And so in that case, I'm going to say, even though we might be able to recognize addictive behavior when we see it, I'm not clear that there is a strong distinction there between the abnormal and the normal type brain functioning. It's the brain is functioning as it should. This is just what happens when you put a brain in these types of circumstances. So that's different than something like Alzheimer's disease.
So, but I mean, in terms of addiction, in that case, we would say that the problem is with the environment and not with the brain. Is that it?
No, I don't know that you would say that. I think you could say that obviously the environment impinges on a brain, and I don't know that we know how to easily addict a brain without having it engage in the environment, but that's true for just about any brain state that we know of. What I'm trying to say is that it's a completely normal brain outcome based on the type of environment that you're in. And that's not to say that the behavior is adaptive. That's not to say it won't kill you. That's not to say it's not a good thing to happen to you. It's just not an abnormal process, the outcome of something abnormal in the brain.
Okay, but in that case, since it might be maladaptive and might cause distress, I mean, when it comes to how we should classify it psychiatrically, I mean, we should still consider it a disease or something like that.
Well, yeah. So when you look at the DSM, the way it talks about addiction is it's these sorts of obsessive behaviors that impact your ability to live your daily life. And so that's true of a lot of psychiatric illnesses. It's not the behavior itself, but rather how much is this behavior impacting your life such that you can't live a normal life. And a lot of that is based on self-report. And the truth is, out in the world, there are a lot of functional addicts who maybe they're hiding their addiction, but they're just fine with it. And then, of course, and I'm talking here about people who are addicted to things like opiates, and they just know how to titrate it. They do their thing every day. You would not know if you saw them walking down the street. They're businessmen, businesswomen. They're fine. A lot of people are addicted to caffeine. They're fine with that. If you don't have the caffeine, you get a headache, you get jittery, you really want that cup of coffee. It is an addiction, but it's not interfering with your daily life. And so a lot of psychiatric illnesses really has to do with how much it's impacting your ability to do you. So it's a very self-reflexive type of diagnosis. So it's very different, say, than getting measles or chickenpox, where, you know, if you have the germ, well, then you have the disease. But this is the way people approach psychiatric illness, I think, is quite different than really a germ theory of disease.
Right, and I mean that would get us into questions of what is a disorder in psychiatry, right? Because I mean, as with addiction, I imagine that probably not all, but many other disorders, people could still be functional with them and perhaps not even seek help from a psychiatrist or a psychologist because somehow they can still be functional and incorporate those, I mean, the respective behaviors and mental experiences into their daily lives.
Sure, sure. And that's the way people think about it, because I think a lot of psychiatric disorders have their roots in normal behavior. And so, you know, when you think about something like obsessive compulsive disorder, well, if your disorder is so bad you can't leave your apartment because you have to tap the door sill just the right way 7 times, all right, that's a problem, and you probably need help for that. But if you need to wash your coffee cup a couple of times just to make sure it's clean before you leave the house, it adds, you know, 2 minutes to your day. You probably don't think anything of it. And so again, it's like how much these sorts of behaviors, you know, this type of nesting behavior and cleaning behaviors interferes with your life. And that's when it becomes a psychiatric disorder.
Mm-hmm. I mean, some of them, even in some occupations, might be helpful. Like, I don't know, perhaps some degree of obsession when you're trying to come up with, when you're, for example, a scientist or someone like that, and you're trying to come up with a breakthrough theory or something like that. I mean, obsessing over reading and looking at the data and stuff like that, perhaps to a limited extent might be, I don't know, valuable.
Sure. That's possible. I mean, certainly with people who are on the autism spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
it's very clear that if you're high functioning autist, that you can do certain things quite well
Mm-hmm.
that people who are not on the spectrum can't do as easily. So I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah. But I mean, when it comes to how our minds operate, can we get new insights into it by looking into these sort of, these sort of conditions where they go awry?
Yeah, I think we can. If nothing else, I think understanding how some of these when they go awry, as you say, when some behavior becomes maladaptive, and we understand what happens in the brain behind it, I think a lot of times at the same time we're learning about how the brain operates normally within normal behavioral parameters. And so I do think it's extremely helpful when you see the extremes of behavior and can understand those. It helps you understand kind of behavior that's more routinized, that's more normal.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, since you deal with philosophy from different kind of scientific areas, like, for example, neuroscience, cognitive science, psychology, and so on, how do you look at the relationship between these different areas of knowledge? So, for example, how do you relate neuroscience to cognitive science and to psychology?
Yeah, I guess I would say I think of them as kind of overlapping domains. I mean, there's a lot that neuroscientists do that is not related much at all to cognition. Trying to understand exactly how nerve cells interact with each other may or may not help us understand, perception. And so, and of course, the questions that they ask are very different, which is why they're different disciplines. So the neuroscientist might be really engaged with understanding how the neurons work, and they can look at all types of neurons in the, in your stomach, which may or may not impact what's going on in the brain, and look at how different processes in the body can impact the brain. So now we know that, your microbiome is very important, and that impacts the brain processes. So those are neuroscience questions, though they can impinge upon psychology. But then psychologists are more interested in, I think, how we experience the world, how we think, how we feel, how we perceive, and how that impacts behavior. And you can obviously see how that's connected to neuroscience, but it's not the same thing. And then psychiatry, really, that's a medical profession. And so they are less interested in, a lot of times, in the why and how, although that's changing slightly. They're really, something has gone awry, it's impacted your life, and their job is to try to fix it. Just like when you go see a medical doctor with a fever, their goal is to help you take the fever away, as opposed to, doing a deep dive into what a fever is and what causes it and so forth. So they're kind of operating connected to psychology and neuroscience, but now you're taking this information and trying to use it in a very practical sort of way to help your fellow humans.
Mm-hmm. So, as a philosopher, what do you think is the role played by, or that philosophers can play in each of these specific subfields and in trying to look across them?
I think the philosopher can play two sorts of roles. On the one hand, I think a lot of people who do bench science, you have to be terribly, terribly specialized, because you're dealing with very sophisticated equipments or very sophisticated testing systems. And by the time you become expert on that, you've sort of laser focused in. And as a result, one has a tendency to keep your head down and do what you need to do to get your experiments to work, to answer the specific questions that you have. And you don't have the luxury of stepping back, even within your own discipline, to say, conceptually, how does this fit with other things within my discipline? And are the methods that I'm using the sort of appropriate methods to use? And is this the best way to do science? And those are all questions I think a philosopher can help answer, because we're not actually doing the research. We might know a lot about it. We might spend time in a lab, but that's not our world 24/7. So we have the luxury of stepping back. And because we have the luxury of stepping back, then I think we can also look at how things relate to each other in a much more detailed and careful way than somebody who's deeply engaged and embedded in a particular discipline might. Again, because that's not where that's not going to get them tenure, is if they step back and do this sort of broader perspective. But that's what a philosopher can bring to the table, is really seeing how all these things fit together and might inform one another.
And do you think that philosophers, because of the cognitive tools they gather, are better at coming up with these broader perspectives of disciplines and across different disciplines than the scientists that are doing the work? Because the scientists themselves also sometimes try to do that.
Sure. Well, I don't want to ever say one person is better than another. What I would say is I think philosophy as a discipline has been more focused on these broader pictures. Mm-hmm. And so they might be able ultimately to contribute more, not because they're better at it, but just because there's more people hours dedicated to that task. And as someone's embedded in the science, yes, they can still do it, but there's not going to be as many people hours dedicated to that task. That's what I think.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Okay, so Dr. Hardcastle, before we go, where can people find your work on the internet?
Well, I guess I would say the easiest thing would be just to Google me, Valerie Hardcastle. That would be it.
Okay, I will try to leave some links to your work, including your books in the description box of the interview. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show. It's thanks to people like you that it keeps running. I will leave links in the description box to Patreon and PayPal. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingburg, Arnold Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windaga, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Des Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidi, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Keon Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Thomas Trumbull, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.